Okay, in this video, we're going to learn how to prevent a very peculiar and sneaky error that can occur. And first, in order to understand what this error is, we're going to first create it and we're going to understand why it happens. And so notice that when something collides or overlaps with our box, we cast that thing to a ball. And if that cast is successful, meaning the thing was a ball, then we spawn three particle systems. So all that looks good. And then when we end overlap with the box, then we destroy those three particle systems, specifically calling them out because we stored them in variables. We created three fire particle system variables, and then we call destroy component on those variables. But what happens if we never created those in the first place? For example, what if I come up to the sequence node, hold Alt, and break that wire? And so this never actually gets called, and the only thing that happens when we begin overlap is we cast it to a ball, but then we don't do anything. So what happens in that case? Well, of course we're not going to make those fire components, so that makes sense. But then what happens when we end overlap, when we roll the ball outside of the box? Well, then what we're going to do is we're going to take our three particle system variables here and call a destroy component on them. But there really isn't anything to destroy. You see, this logic that we had before, we had this spawn emitter at location, and what that actually does is creates a particle system, it constructs one, and then we take that value and store it into fire particle system 1. Before this node, this spawn emitter at location node, our fire particle system 1, it just existed as an empty variable. There really was no value inside of it. It just existed as a variable without any real particle system inside. In order to populate it with valid particle system data, we had to spawn one first. So particle systems are spawned, and then if you want to store a reference to it, then you actually populate that data in the fire particle system 1 variable. But now that we've disconnected this sequence node, we're not actually doing that. So fire particle system 1, 2, and 3 are just empty variables. They don't really have anything valid in there. And so what happens when we try to access a destroy component function from an empty variable is we're trying to call a function that isn't really there. So we can hit compile here, and we can hit play, and what happens is we're going to overlap, but we're not going to create any fire, so we didn't expect that. But when we end overlap, there's a silent error going on. And when we hit escape, you'll see that all of a sudden we get a message log, we get a message down here that says errors/warnings, and if we look at the error log, it says blueprint runtime error, access none, trying to read property particle system 1. And it also tells you, this is a very useful tool to use when you get an error, it tells you the actor in which the error occurred, and then it also tells you where the error occurred in the event graph, and it even actually tells you the specific node that caused the error, destroy component. And these are links, so you can click on destroy component, and it'll actually show you, and it'll highlight destroy component. It'll say this is the causer of the error, this is where the problem is. So these message logs that show you errors are actually really useful to diagnose any problems that occur. And so these three errors happen because we're trying to call destroy component on particle systems that are empty. They don't have any data in them, and that is known as trying to access none. Let's do this again. Let's hit play. Let's overlap and begin and end overlap, then hit escape, and let's take a look, and you'll see that we get accessed none. So fire particle system is not valid, it's just empty. And the reason I'm showing you this is because we can program into our blueprint functionality a little check that will first check to see if this particle system is valid, if it has anything populating it, and it's not none. And if that check succeeds, then we can call destroy component. But until then, if that none is accessed, if it accesses none and there's nothing valid in there, then we don't need to call a destroy component because there's nothing to destroy. And so how do we do that? Well, what we do is we take our particle system here, our particle system 1, drag off of it, and type is valid. And you'll see that is valid if we check context sensitive. Remember, that should be checked, otherwise you'll see a bunch of irrelevant stuff. So with context sensitive checked, it'll filter out everything and only show you what's valid here. And so you'll have this function is valid, and we have this one with a question mark, and we're going to choose the one with the question mark. And what this does is it takes an input execution pin, so we're going to use that, and it checks to see if fire particle system 1 is valid. If it is valid, then we can call destroy component on it. If it's not valid, we simply do nothing, so we don't need to actually put anything there. And so is valid is what's going to prevent destroy component from even being called if there is no data in fire particle system 1. So this is a good check. So I'm going to drag out this comment section just so that we can fit everything in here. And let's go ahead and highlight these other calls to destroy component. And what I'm going to do is let's drag these fire particle systems over here so we have room. And I'm going to drag off of fire particle system 2 and type is valid. And I'm going to use the one with the check with the question mark. And I'm going to take the second sequence execution pin, the one that says then 1, and hook that up. And then for the is valid, I'm going to hook that up to destroy component. And I'm going to do the same thing for fire particle system 3. And I'm actually going to just have is valid highlighted and put my mouse cursor down here and Control W, and that way I'll just copy it. And then I'll take the then 2 node and the pin and just drag it in here and drag in is valid. And then finally, don't forget this part, take fire particle system 3 and drag that into the is valid as well. And so now what we'll do is we'll actually check each of these to see if they're valid. And if they're not, we won't even do anything. So if we go back and hit play and we come over and overlap, we're still not creating the fire. We don't have the fire particle systems. But when we end overlap and then we escape, you'll see that we don't get any errors. No errors occurred. They were prevented because we checked to see if the fire particle systems were valid first. And since they were not, then we didn't do anything. But when those fire particle systems are valid, then is valid execution pin fires and we destroy them. So we will make them valid if we reconnect these nodes up here. So if we go ahead and hook up this sequence node, now these fire particle systems actually will be spawned. And then when we check to see if these variables are valid, they will be, and we'll destroy them. So let's go back, hit play, click in the viewport. We'll overlap and create those particle systems. We'll end overlap and they'll be destroyed. And so now there's no risk of silent, nasty errors that can occur if you don't check to see if things are valid first. So this is valid node is extremely useful for that. Now notice we've got nodes and wires going behind nodes and things like that. And this is a good opportunity to either double click and use a reroute node like so. You can do that and make that a little bit more orderly. Or another thing you could do is, I'm going to delete that reroute node and just take the fire particle system node and just duplicate it and just drag it in here. That would do the same thing. So whichever one you choose is a matter of style, but it's generally a good idea to keep your blueprints nice and orderly so there aren't too many crossing wires and things, because that looks confusing when you come back later. So I like to use this method of basically copying the nodes and bringing them in. So I'm going to disconnect this node and bring this second fire particle system node up on top of the is valid, and then I'm going to just copy it. And if you do copy it, don't forget to drag those pins, those wires in, because otherwise it's not going to work. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing for the third one. And now you'll see that these are nice and more organized, and you can organize to your heart's content until these things look nice and make a lot of sense, and in that way you can just take one good look at it and know exactly what it does. Now, I showed you how to make comments. You can also have comment sections inside of comment sections. So for example, if you wanted, you can highlight this section here, hit the C key, and you can type in destroy fire particle system, oops, I'm hitting a bunch of keys, system 1, and that way you have your own comment section here, and then with a single click you can just drag them around without having to highlight them all. And so that's a good way to organize within comment sections. So I'm going to comment this one and say destroy fire particle system 2, and I will highlight this one, drag it down a little bit, and comment this one and say destroy fire particle system. Whoops, there I go again, system 3. And now we have comments inside, and I'm going to make this overall big comment section bigger, and that way we can get these organized. And generally I don't like to have text bubbles overlapping other text bubbles because that defeats the whole purpose. The purpose is to be very obvious what you're doing here and have good comments that show you exactly what's going on. So something like this should do just fine. So that's how you have comment sections inside of other comment sections and keep things nice and organized. So that concludes this video on the isValid node, and that's a very useful node. We're going to use that throughout the course to check to make sure that variables have valid data in them before we try to access functions that belong to those variables.